if you happen to see this recording down the road, there is a chance that some of that information may have been updated since the time of this recording. Additionally, because we're recording it, sometimes when we talk about information that I'm going to present today, it can be really challenging. We're talking about things that maybe have happened to us, things that have happened to people who we love and care about. And so I want to just invite people to hold kind of reflective thoughts or feelings till the end when we stop recording. And that way it's a safe space, just kind of in an environment where we all are sharing today. It's perfectly okay to share. I really love hearing from everyone, but I want to make sure that we don't have that be something that's recorded and passed on to people who aren't part of today's meeting in person. So I'm going to get moving. I just want to let people know that I have a hard time seeing the chat box when I'm presenting, which just means that you are welcome to put questions in the chat box, and Kendall's going to keep an eye on it. If it's something that feels really relevant to the slide I'm presenting at the moment, she'll let me know that it's something for me to touch upon. But otherwise, if it's a more kind of larger thought question, we can address it at the end. Maybe it's something we'll get to at some point. So before we get, before we get started, I really want to give a special thank you to both Community Compass and to Blue Hill Library who've invited me today. So I'm going to pass it over to Kendall to kind of introduce you to both those organizations.
Thank you so much, Ruby. I'm thrilled that we were able to work this out and you're here. So thank you so much for coming. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining. I'm Kendall. I'm the Teen Services Librarian at the Blue Hill Library, and I'm also a board member for Community Compass. So I helped a lot with bridging the two organizations together to bring you this workshop, which we are really excited about. I think everyone's pretty familiar with what the library does, but Community Compass, people are still learning about. It's a great nonprofit organization that is helping to try and break the cycle of poverty in the Peninsula region and helping people with needs that they may not be able to get help for elsewhere. It's a really great organization, and I just love being a part of the board for it. So if you're curious about it, I'll put a link to their website in the chat. Beyond that, I will really be here to help with like technical stuff. So if you have some issues with your internet or your computer and you get bumped out of the workshop, feel free to just join back in. I'll be monitoring everything. So if you need to come back, I'll make sure to admit you to the room. You can also send me a chat directly if you have any questions. And then, like Ruby mentioned, I will be keeping an eye on the chat for questions in regards to Ruby's presentation. So feel free to put questions in there and I'll make sure that we get a chance to answer them. I think that's everything for now. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ruby and we're going to get to learn some really interesting information from her.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to also introduce who I am and where I'm coming from. So my name is Ruby. I live in Bath, so I'm a little bit outside of your area. And it is a very windy day here for me. I'm not sure if it's the same for anyone else. Beautiful sunshine, but really windy, which is actually kind of really nice. I work for the Maine Resilience Building Network. We're a statewide nonprofit. We provide education and awareness building around the impact of adverse childhood experiences and the importance of building protective factors, such as positive relationships for all of our community members. And so today, that's really what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be providing some education around what are adverse childhood experiences, how do they impact us, and what does resilience mean? So before we get started, I like to do this practice really just because we often are kind of coming into something like this. We've got a time clock, a reminder, we got to get started. And sometimes that can be, we forget to sort of let go of anything we might be carrying with us from our morning, any sort of stressful event we might have experienced. And so I really just invite people to take about 30 seconds to kind of, you can close your eyes if that feels comfortable, and just really let go of anything you might be carrying with you today so that we can focus and talk together. Great. I'm going to welcome you back. So, today, like I said, we're going to talk a bit. We're going to start by talking about what does trauma or adversity do inside our brains and our bodies as we grow up, and how does our bodies respond to that? What's our stress response? And then we're going to talk about ways that we can regulate that stress response, regulate those emotions, um, as well as understand what kind of role can we play in building protective factors for um, our children, for our families, for our communities, and ways we can build a really resilient community as a whole. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I talk about this because I believe that we kind of have all the same goal of building healthy and thriving communities, healthy and thriving children, building a strong support system for future generations. I have a 3-year-old son, and I really hope that the world that he grows up in is strong and resilient. And I think we've had a really challenging last year and a half. It's been a lot of challenging times, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how our body handles that type of stress and how we can build in different strategies for ourselves that will help us be stronger for the people who we love, and help us kind of build that into our children as well. So I want to talk about, how does the experiences we have, why does it really matter? And it's because our genes set the stage for us. Our brains and bodies are experience dependent, meaning that the experiences that we have early in life stick with us as we go through life. And it actually helps kind of decide a pathway in which we are able to process information later on. It helps decide ways that we interact with other people, how we regulate our emotions and understand our sense of control in our world. And so as our brains develop, they have sensitive periods of time. And so our brains develop all the way until we're in early adulthood. And then we have this process called neuroplasticity, which means that our brains are actually able to kind of learn new pieces of information, even if we get older than that and our brains have fully formed. So I'm going to show you guys a short video. It's about 4 minutes long, and it really talks about what happens inside our brain, the serve and response factors in early childhood brains.
The physical architecture of the development.
Oops, let's get that started again.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious, ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
Great. I love that video. It's by the Alberta Brain Wellness Center in Canada. It's a great resource for people. But let's talk about more about what that video told us and talks about. And how our brains are formed, as the video showed you, talks about this way of interacting with children where we pass information back and forth for one another, and our brains are actually built in a certain way. And they're absolutely right that if we start off really strong, we end up with really strong brains later in life. So why is this? What you're looking at right here is something, it's inside our brains, it's our neuroconnections and the synapses, how quickly we pass information between one part of our brain to the other. And you can see when we're first born, we have very few synaptic connections happening. Basically, you can see there's very few neurons inside the brain. And the reality is when we're first born, we don't need to do a whole lot of things. That's why we have adults to take care of us. We learn how to cry really quickly. We learn how to suck in order to get food. And our bodies learn how to process that food into bowel movements. But we actually don't even know how to regulate our own temperature at that point. So when we're first born, we're not writing theme papers, we're not writing anything, we're not reading, we're learning and adapting from the people around us. And what we see by the time the child's about 5 or 6 years old, what we see is that their brains have stored basically almost all the experiences they've had in life. You can see there a ton of connections are happening. In fact, children are processing around the ages of 3 to 10 years old are processing 3 times as many pieces of information than an adult is. So for those of us who have young children, you probably have seen this in their very way of thinking, the way they remember things. And for those of you who are adults who might think you know more than children, the reality is right now, those kids are storing a lot of information in their brains. But it's not easy for us to function at that kind of level all the time. And so what we see is that by the time we hit puberty, around 14 years old, our brains go through a process of pruning, is what it's called. And it's really actually a way of kind of cutting off those connections that were used less frequently throughout those earlier years. And so basically it says, I don't think this information is critical for me to survive, and therefore I'm going to push that information to the side. But the types of experiences that I've had that were scary or alarming, or I just had those experiences more frequently, my brain says that information is really important. It's critical for me to have later in life, and therefore I'm going to store that information. A lot of this information that we see is this activation of our stress response system in our amygdala. So that's that orange little piece of the screen that you're seeing in front of you, the picture of the brain. And the amygdala is our stress response. And this is when we have something scary or alarming or threatening happen to us, our brains store that information. Those are going to be some of those synapses that are going to stay very strong. And it's because the amygdala's job is to help us survive at all cost. I kind of like to think of an amygdala as those guards at Buckingham Palace in England, the ones who stand really, really still. They've got big funny hats, and it doesn't matter how many funny faces you make at them, if you crack jokes, they are focused, and they are focused just on scanning for danger. They're not going to interact with you whatsoever. And if they see danger, that's when they're going to interact. That's like our amygdala inside our brain. Our brain's job is to keep us safe. And so the amygdala is scanning for danger all day long, scanning, and when it sees danger, it kicks into gear. The thing about our amygdala too is that as our brains and bodies are developing, children's bodies are especially susceptible to that flood of cortisol, which is our stress hormone. And because they're more susceptible to that, it can become damaging to their bodies if they have that stress activation happen over and over and over again. Think of it like a muscle. The more you work on that muscle, if you're lifting weights on just one side of your body, that muscle is going to get really big. And that's like our amygdala. The more that we activate that amygdala, the more it gets bigger and ready to respond to danger at any point. So what does this mean for people? The reality is that when we're in that state of stress response, when we're in a space of under stress, we have a difficult time relaxing because our brains are on alert. We're looking for stress. We're scanning for danger at all points. And when we're doing those things, our brain's whole brain is focused on survival, and therefore we can't take in any new information. When we're under threat, when we're feeling stressed, we're actually have a really hard time doing anything but trying to get rid of those stress hormones, get rid of that cortisol and calm down. And so therefore we don't learn new information. So if you work with children in a school, or if you work with children in an after school program, or even your own children, when they're in a state of being stressed or anxious, they are not going to be able to kind of think critically and process information and calm down no matter what you say to them. And so what we have to do is focus on decreasing that sense of threat to their brains and their bodies. So I'm going to switch gears and stop talking about the brain. Some of you might be excited about that. It's a little overwhelming sometimes the first time we learn about that. And I'm going to talk about something called the ACE study. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And the reason I'm going to talk about that is because this was the first piece of information that we have that helped us understand what that impact of that stress response on our brains, what happens to it over a long period of time. How is this information stored within our bodies? And this is really sometimes a challenging part for us to talk about, because what I'm going to speak to are things that you yourself may have experienced, things that you know people in your life have experienced. And so it can be really challenging to listen to this sometimes because it makes us kind of think back to something. It might be a little bit triggering. And so I invite you that if anything that I'm talking about is stressful or makes you feel not so great, take care of yourself, step away from the computer, put it on mute, lower the volume, whatever it takes to just make sure you're feeling okay in the moment. And also I will provide my email address at the end of the training. So if you have follow-up thoughts or questions you want to process with me, I am here to listen to that. So the ACE study, this was a study done by the CDC, which is our Centers for Disease Control at a national level, and Kaiser Permanente, which is a healthcare plan. It was based out of California. It was done in the late 90s. And it was done with a very large group of people. Most research studies that we have available are done in relatively small populations of people, and then they kind of replicate it in different spaces. This was one study done with a huge group of insured adults, because they were all part of the Kaiser Permanente plan. And they were actually mostly white, mostly middle-class, college-educated people. And this idea was that this group of people are pretty well off. They're middle class. Our assumption is they must kind of have everything going for them. And that's because our society says that those kind of characteristics mean people are in a good place. And so they asked them questions about experiences they had in early life prior to the age of 18. They asked them questions about whether they had experienced any form of child abuse, which include physical, sexual, or psychological abuse, any forms of neglect, physical neglect or emotional neglect, or if been raised in a household where there was parental separation or divorce, where one of the parents had been incarcerated or interacted with the criminal justice system. At the time of the study, I told you it was done in the 90s. They asked specifically whether the mother had been treated with violence in the home or had been threatened with violence. Nowadays, when we talk about this information, we really recognize that violence can happen in the home to either adult or to the children as well. And so we talk about it in terms of domestic violence. At the time, they specifically referred to mothers being injured inside the home. It asked if there was anyone in the household who was suffering with a substance use disorder, or anyone in the household with a mental illness. And basically, it was 10 questions. Have any one of these situations ever happened to you? It didn't matter whether it happened once, it happened multiple times, but did any one of these 10 situations happen? And what they found, remember that population was an assumption that these people must have, be pretty well off, had a great life. And what they found is just that's not true. ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of that original study had experienced at least one of those things. And in fact, when we talk about ACEs now, those numbers sometimes are even greater than that, depending on where we're talking. What you can see here are the numbers from the original ACE study. And in just a moment, I'm going to get into what does that look like here in Maine for us. But what you can tell is right off the bat, these things happen commonly. And sometimes this is helpful for people who've experienced this to recognize that they're not alone, that these things are not just something that happen to some people in some places. The second thing that was really important for them to recognize within this study is that the more ACEs that someone had, the worse their health outcomes were. So there was a powerful relationship between ACEs and reduced health and well-being. So what they had at the time of the study is they asked people questions and then they compared them to their health records and questions about the health and kind of any sort of social and well-being standard that they have at the time. And basically what they saw was something called a dose-response relationship. You can think about it like the more gas you put in the car, the further you drive. And this study highlighted that the more ACEs someone had, the more negative health outcomes that someone experienced. So I told you I was going to talk about what that looks like in Maine. In Maine, about 1 in 5 high school students have experienced 4 or more ACEs. 4 or more ACEs is what we consider kind of like a tipping point for all of those different problems. When you come back to this slide, you can see this step-by-step increase in health outcomes. When we get to 4 and 5, those chances or risk of health problems sometimes double or triple depending on what type of a condition we are talking about. So in Maine, that's a concern. We have a large number of our youth who experience number of ACEs within their community or within their life to date. We also have information of what does this mean for our youth. So this information that I'm showing you here is, and the next couple of slides actually, are data that we have from the Maine CDC through our Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey, which is a survey that's asked of middle school and high school youth. And so of those students who identify that they have 4 or more ACEs, they've experienced some of those things that I talked about earlier. What we see is that they're more likely to have depression, more likely to have considered suicide. They're also 3 times more likely to smoke cigarettes, 2 times more likely to be bullied at school, 2 times more likely to drink alcohol at the age of, this is asking questions of high school, and 2 times more likely to use marijuana. And I'm going to talk about why that is. And it really has to do with our body's way of processing that stress. and why it's so important for us to be building resilience and buffering from those impacts. The other thing I want us to kind of shed light on is the fact that our Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey data, again, asking youth about their own experiences, about 13.6 of Maine students identify as being gay, lesbian, transgender, or bisexual. And when you extend that into youth that aren't sure about their sexual identity, they're questioning their sexual identity, or they're questioning their gender identity, we get about 1 in 5 of our high school youth, about 20% of our high school youth are identifying as being heterosexual or non-cisgendered. And so this is a really large group of youth in Maine. Again, we have a high number of youth with ACEs and a high number of youth who are identifying as non-heterosexual or non-cisgendered. And the alarming thing with this is that LGBT students are less likely to have support from adults, and they're twice as likely to have 4 or more ACEs than our non-LGBT students. And so again, when I talk about some of these risk factors as we move through today's presentation, I think it's really important for us to recognize that these numbers are disproportionate of people who are experiencing some of these things. And so when you look at this kind of things of, do youth feel like they have parents who support them, family who provides love and support from other adults in their community, or feel like their community believes that they matter, we see lower scores amongst certain groups of youth. And this is where we get into, I don't know if anyone can hear in the background my toddler talking. I can. So what we get into this space is looking at where are our adversities in our home or in our community. And what we see is that adverse childhood experiences, that whole study that I just talked about, was really talking about what's happening inside people's homes. But the reality is that our community environments play a really important role in this. And you can see this image here is called the pair of ACEs, looking at what's happening inside children's homes, as well as what's happening inside our community. And so you can see the roots of our foundation, of our tree, are just as important as what's happening inside the home. And this is where we kind of think about the term social determinants of health and what role that they play in the health and well-being of our whole community. And so if you think back to what I first started talking about, when I talked about brain development, I was talking about how our brains respond to stressful experiences. And that does not determine whether that's in our home or in our community. And so when we see stressful experiences happening over and over again to someone, that is going to have the same type of impact on our health and well-being as the experiences that we have inside the home. And so we want to look at how do we create strong foundations for youth everywhere they go, because we don't always know what's happening inside someone's home. So if you work with children, this is the reason why your role is so important, because we can't always know what's happening inside of someone's home. If you're a parent, you do have an idea of what's happening inside your home, but it's really important to be looking at how is the community responding to my child, or what other children in my life could I be doing more to support them? And we're going to talk about ways that we can play that supportive role. And so this is a quote that I just really love, because when we hear this information, it can be really challenging. And this is so uplifting to think about the fact that we have the ability to solve these problems. And so this is by Dr. Nadine Burkharis. She is a pediatrician and now the Surgeon General for the state of California. And she says, I believe that when we find the courage to look this problem in the face, we will have the power to transform not only our health, but our world. And so the very act of all of you being here today with me is taking that first step of saying, I need to know this information. And when I know this information, I take different steps in my life. I spread this information to other people. So what do ACEs look like, sound like, and feel like? So for those of you who work with children, or you are just a community member who believe that you have a role to play in this space, what might this look like in the children who you interact with? And that's an important thing for us to look at. What children who are experiencing adversity, what might they see? And so children's emotions and behaviors to trauma are going to look different across the board. There's no kind of cut and dry thing we're going to see. But what we may see is that there might be reenacting patterns or relationships from things that they've had. We may see an increased interaction with a caregiver, even if that attention is negative. There may be a sense to want to kind of keep people at a distance, of not having a sense of trust with other people. They might vent their frustrations or anger or sadness or anxieties. And they are doing that to protect themselves. So that wall that they may build because they don't trust people, or kind of any sort of anger that they may put out, or sadness, or the sense of shutting down, is a way to protect them. And those behaviors communicate a message to us. So what do we see in children? What does this do to them? What we see is a number of different challenges. And again, not any one of these things is a definite sign that trauma has been going on. It's more about that relationship you have with them. Over time, are you noticing these things kind of building upon one another? Or it might be that once we stop and know this information, we look at some of these behaviors slightly different. And so I say that because sometimes the behaviors we see in children, when they're responding to the trauma or adversity that they've had, can be things like aggression, or they can be things like acting out, or having what we consider as quote unquote behavioral problems within our school. They're not behaving the way we think children are supposed to be behaving. But what we also could see is really kind of the opposite of that. We can see children who are really, really quiet, very detached. They're avoiding things. Maybe they have very little emotional reaction to something. And so sometimes what we think is that we see children in our schools or in our community that may be acting out, and we think that that's a child that something's going on inside their home or in their community. But we don't always look at the child who might be kind of more withdrawn and quiet as being someone who might need just as much support as the other children. The really strong and important thing I want to talk about, and something that as I shift my presentation to kind of the second part of this, is for us to remember that ACEs are predictive, meaning that we have knowledge and understanding of what could happen, but they're not determinative. They are not a diagnosis. So if you are someone who is sitting here with me today and you are thinking about how many ACEs do I have? What is my ACE score? And thinking about kind of all those scary things I talked about in terms of your health and well-being, the reality is that that's just not true. It is not a diagnosis that if you have a certain number of ACEs, you're definitely going to have these challenges later in life. Really, knowing the ACE science helps us recognize where are any ACEs in our lives. It gives us a language, a toolkit to talk about this should we feel comfortable to talk about it. It also helps us develop ways to support people who do have ACEs. So what we talk about for the rest of the presentation is, how do we support other people? How do we support ourselves? And then lastly, it helps us form new neuro connections with people. So ultimately, we can't erase the trauma that someone's experienced, but we can help someone kind of buffer from that experiences that they've had, build new connections, positive connections as they move through life. So we're going to switch gears and talk about resilience. What is resilience? When I say that, sometimes resilience is something that people talk a lot about this idea of like a rubber band. And so we stretch a rubber band and it bounces back, it comes back into its shape. But I think resilience is deeper than that. And over this last year and a half, what we've seen is this term resilience being put into place all over the place. I hear people all the time say, oh, children are so resilient. They just handle these situations better. And it's really important for us to stop saying that and to stop thinking that. Because the reality is, resilience is something that we have to learn. It's something that we can learn very easily, but it has to be fostered within us. And so this book, Ordinary Magic from Ann Maston, is a fantastic resource if you're a reader. And Kendall, I just realized as a librarian, I'm going to send you a book list of all the books I referenced today. Make sure you guys have them in hand at the library. But resilience is the capacity of a system to adapt under difficult circumstances. And when I say the term system, I actually mean anything. So we as an individual, we're complicated systems. We're bodies of organs and muscles and hormones and memories. And so therefore we are a system. Our family is a system. Our community is a system. So resilience is the capacity of any one of us or any group of us to adapt given really difficult circumstances. And the reason that resilience is such an important thing is because resilience helps us, it tips our scale basically. So this is a really good way to think about everything I've been talking about today, those kind of hard things, those stressors, that adversity that we experience is one side of our scale. So it's like if you're sitting on a seesaw and you have a bunch of stuff piled down on one side. Resilience are all those good things, all of those positive people, those positive experiences we have that can help us tip that seesaw to the other side. And the fulcrum, the part of the seesaw that it rests on is us as a person, our genetics, our DNA. And some of those things are things we can't control. So those are things that we have in, it's experiences we've had in the past. It's the DNA that we receive, our genetics. But what happens is that when we are put there in the center and we have some negative things happen to us, we can balance that out by adding more good things to the other side. And so resilience is a way of tipping the scale, even when we experience future stresses or hard things. So what does resilience look like? How do we get resilience? I said it's something we need to foster in people. It's not the hardest thing for us to do. We just have to figure out a way to make sure that this is available to everybody and for us to be focusing on building this in everyone. So the kind of short list for resilience, some things kind of right off the bat to start our brains thinking about what does resilience look like in our home, for our family, in our community. It starts with capable caregiving and parenting, and we're going to talk more about that. It's about close relationships with other capable adults. So it's really important for children to have lots of positive relationships with adults that are quality relationships focused on teaching new skills. And ideally, we have those relationships with more adults than just our parents. It's about close friends and partners throughout our life. It's about kind of problem-solving skills and building our intelligence, our emotional intelligence. It's about self-control and emotion regulation. We get resilience when we have self-efficacy, which is self-efficacy means a sense that we can do something. So that's our belief in ourselves. What does that look like? How do we build that? And then lastly, we get resilience through a number of different places where we find meaning in life, through our community, through effective schools, through effective neighborhoods, spaces that are working together to build efficacy amongst all of our community members. And so I like to kind of think of resilience as resilience is what we build inside of ourselves. So that's those kind of 5 different C's in the middle there. That's how we build resilience within people. But we also want to foster resilience in our environments. And so that looks through our supportive caregiving relationships. It looks that way through setting high expectations for people, providing opportunities for participation, and then lastly, having cultural connections, sources of faith, hope, and cultural traditions. And that looks different for everybody. So those 5 C's that makes resilience within people, what are those 5 C's? So the first one, these are kind of the 5 individual ingredients or attributes that promote resilience. So the first one is competence. It's the ability to handle situations effectively. It's not a vague feeling that I can do this, but really true competence that's acquired through actual experiences. Through practice, children develop these skills and allow them to trust their own judgment and make responsible choices when they're faced with difficult situations. So we build competence in youth by allowing them opportunities to practice that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Are you setting up opportunities? And are you an adult in a child's life who's giving them opportunities to handle challenging situations? Even if they don't do well, it's all right, set them up for it, practice that skill, provide new opportunities for it. So the second C is confidence. True confidence, that's the solid belief in one's own ability. That's that self-efficacy. And it's rooted in our competence. So when we have opportunities to practice something, we gain confidence through that. So children gain confidence by demonstrating that they have competence in real situations. So giving them opportunities to practice skills, learn new skills, and making sure that opportunity is provided in a safe environment, meaning I don't mean physical safety, like don't let them jump, or like if they hurt themselves, then we failed at everything. No, I mean safety in the sense that you're not going to be disappointed in them, that you're not going to let them there's any sort of consequences for them practicing that skill and not being good at it. Really knowing that you have faith in them, that they're going to practice it and they'll over time become better at that skill. So the third C is character. So children need a fundamental sense of right or wrong to ensure that they're prepared to make wise choices and contribute to the world and become stable adults. So children with character have a sense of self-worth and self-confidence. So again, you can see these things build upon one another. And we're more comfortable sticking with their own values and demonstrate a caring attitude towards others when they have that character built into them. The fourth C here is coping. So children who learn to cope effectively with stress are better prepared to overcome life challenges. And by doing that, they're best protected against unsafe, worrisome behaviors, and they end up with a set of positive adaptive coping skills. And we're going to talk, I have more on how we build those coping skills. And then the final C here is a sense of control. And so knowing that their decisions and actions determine their results and outcome, that children feel like rather than things just happening to them, that they have the ability to make decisions, they have a bit of control, especially for children who've experienced trauma or adversity, or who are currently experiencing them. Many situations are completely out of their control. And so it's really important for us as adults in the lives of children to ensure that we are allowing for opportunities for them to practice their own sense of control. How can they make decisions that promote and further, build their sense of competence and confidence? Are we setting up opportunities where we say, here are some options. You go ahead and pick for yourselves. Really looking at where we can offer them some sense of control when so many other things are out of their control. So resilience is one piece of the puzzle here. And the other piece is protective factors. How do we as adults build in environments or build ourselves into a place that we can help protect youth? And my screen is really big. It might look a little fuzzy for you guys. But really what we're looking at here is thinking about ourselves as an umbrella. How can we be a protective factor for children in our lives? So protective factors are individual or environmental characteristics, conditions, or behaviors that reduce the effects of stressful life events. So what does that look like? Protective factors are things that we can push that we can provide for people at an individual level. We can provide protective factors at a family level, and we can push them at a community level. So these are things that we can do to support individual children. It's things we can do to protect families and things we can do to build into our community so that everyone within our community has that protective factor. So what's that look like? When we see those risk factors or those things, those negative, hard, stressful things we experience throughout life. They look very different. Some of them are those ACEs that I spoke about. Some of them are just stressful experiences. So what we look at, for instance, this last year of COVID-19, that could be a risk factor for an individual person when we think about someone's personal health. It could be a risk factor when we think about increased isolation amongst certain people within our community. But there's also a risk factor within families. We see that families who have a lot of challenges and maybe lost a job, they might be at risk of losing their housing. They maybe had decreased access to food or other resources that are really needed. And at a community level, we see it that there is a number of different risk factors for a whole community around COVID-19 in terms of the stability of our community as we move forward. So protective factors would be things that we do to help make sure we buffer from those experiences. Things that we can put into place that would make sure we protect a family unit, that we can do to protect an individual's health and well-being, things that we put into place into our community to make sure that we're thinking of the whole community. So one of the biggest protective factors that we see, and you can think back to that way we build resilience in people, one of the key things I've said already is around caring relationships with adults. And that is something, I don't want to just dumb this down to just this idea that, okay, if you're nice to children, that's great, you're a caring adult. No, I want to really make you think about that term being a caring adult, meaning someone who is reliable, someone who is trustworthy, someone who's offering those opportunities for them to practice those skills, to build their confidence and their competence. So that's what I mean when I talk about caring relationships are key. So when we talk to people who've experienced high ACEs, and for those of you in the room right now who are thinking about kind of your own history, your own life, many times the difference in someone's life is thinking back to who is someone who made you believe you were important, made you believe that you belonged, made you believe you mattered. And oftentimes there is a very clear point of recognizing one person in their lives, at least one person, who made them feel like that they mattered. And many times those adults are people in our school system. Not always, but that is usually the first kind of place where we have those relationships with other adults. And so it's really important for us to recognize the role that we play in the lives of other children. So even if you're in the room and you're thinking about the role that you play as a mother or as a father, really also stop and think about, what role do I play in the lives of other children around me, with my child's friends? Am I someone who's a caring adult in their life? And maybe I don't know what's happening inside their home, but they maybe need my support more than I think that they do. Or you might be someone who's part of your community who is, every day you go to the grocery store and you notice the person checking you out is a young adult who your time and effort of spending a couple extra moments to let them know how important they are and the role that they play could really make a difference. So when we see these relationships with caring adults, what we see is it's associated with future successes. So it's not only helps them in terms of their schooling, it helps them have a greater satisfaction, it helps them be more engaged in their academic work. They're more likely to have higher education achievement, healthy relationships with other people, have positive attitudes and views, all of which help us build our resilience and help us buffer from those negative experiences, regardless of if they're still happening in our lives or not. And the reason for this is because of oxytocin. So oxytocin is kind of known as our love hormone. And it's the way our bodies, this is naturally produced when we give birth. It's part of bonding attachment with early childhood. It's the reason we promote skin to skin with a mother who's just given birth, because it's our way of bonding, naturally having that connection. And oxytocin is kind of the antidote to ACEs, because oxytocin is the opposite hormone as cortisol. So I talked about how cortisol, that stress hormone, floods our system, and oxytocin is the opposite of that. It's going to help bring that stress level down right away for us. So oxytocin is really important for children, but it's also really good for adults. So this is something it's universal. We can apply this to kind of anyone. And the way we get oxytocin is through a number of different things. We get it through emotional support from people. So when we provide emotional support, or when someone gives us emotional support, we receive oxytocin. Both of us receive a dose of oxytocin. We get it through hugs, through deep connections with other humans. We get it naturally through sunlight. So that feeling of warmth on our skin when we stand outside, we're naturally getting a dose of oxytocin in that space. We get it through listening to music or making music. So if you're an artist, you can get it in that way too. We get it when we express support, when we tell someone how much we care about them. We also get it by being an active or empathetic listener, meaning we're really engaged with someone and we're listening to them deeply, listening to their fears, their hopes, whatever that is. So these are all ways that we naturally get oxytocin. And so that's a really important factor for us to look at. How can we provide more opportunities for natural oxytocin rather than synthetic ways of getting that type of hormone, which we can see sometimes through the use of drugs and alcohol, which is why we can see when we talked earlier about ACEs and risk factors, we saw that some of the ways that people can have higher risks, we saw from the Maine data that children with higher ACEs were more likely to use marijuana, more likely to drink. And that's because that's a way for their bodies to feel a little bit better, their brains to feel a little bit better. They're getting some hormones that are positive and helping them get away from those cortisol, but they're unfortunately getting it in an artificial way. So we want to focus on getting those types of hormones in positive ways in our community and kind of fostering that in other people. So there's research and science that tell us that adults who've experienced strong connections when they were younger are less likely to have mental health issues, less likely to experience violence, less likely to use substances, or less likely to engage in risky behaviors. And so this, again, is just a sign that when we kind of look at ways to provide healthy, strong, caring relationships for children, we do amazing things to support their health and well-being throughout the whole course of their life. And it's true here in Maine. So again, this is some data in Maine. So what we see is that people who have parents who believe that they help them succeed are less likely to consider suicide, less likely to use marijuana. And ones who receive support from other adults are, again, same thing, and who have caring school environments. So we can look at different ways of building in these buffers, building in the resilience, not only in people's homes, but also in the way that they connect with other adults in our communities and overall environments or overall community. Do we have schools that are caring? And this is where I'd like to kind of invite you to think of ACEs and trauma and adversity as being an invisible backpack. We don't always have the opportunity to know exactly what someone's carrying with them. And so it's really important for us to know we don't always know what's happening inside someone's home. Or they could have a fantastic home, but we don't know what's happening when they walk out our door and into a school or into the community. So it's really important for us to recognize that it's important for children to have those supportive systems in all three places, in their home, in their schools, and in their community. And so each one of us plays a role in that. So I think some people here are probably focused on what's happening in the home. Some people might be playing a role of how do we support our community? And some people may have the opportunity to play that role of how do we create those safe, caring environments for children within our school systems, making sure we have strong supportive systems for them there too. It's important for us to look at that across all three of our systems because we don't always know what's happening in the other one. And so that's where it really plays a role of recognizing our place in all of this. So the other way we build resilience that I mentioned is around high expectations. So having high expectations is another protective factor. When youth live up, I don't know how that just came about. That's odd. Uh-oh. Uh-oh, we got a computer freeze situation.
What is going on?
Interesting. I have no idea what just happened there. Let's test this out again. I don't even know if I had that ability to do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's so funny.
Well, good. There we go. That's right. High expectations. So, this is our way of looking at youth need adults who believe in them unconditionally. Remember when I said earlier about providing opportunities for them to practice skills? It's about that unconditional space of saying, I believe in you. I know you can do this. And not having it that being conditional to any sort of success. It's not saying, I think you can do this if you do that or this, or if you do that or this, I will give you this type of feedback. It's simply saying unconditionally, well, you know what? It's Fiona. Fiona is able to color on my screen. I have no idea how you're able to do that, Fiona, but that's quite all right. I kind of like it. So anyway.
I've never seen that before. This is a new feature.
We learn something new every day. It's quite all right. It's a good coloring. I like it. So these high expectations, this is ways the messages of like, how do we give these messages across the board? The other thing I just want to remind people, I've been talking a lot about how we provide these environments for children. But the reality is we probably have some adults in our community who haven't been getting these types of messages, haven't had connections with people, because they may be people who've experienced that. They have a harder time connecting with people. So all of this messaging that I'm giving you about how we build resilience in children, the goal is that we're building this early on. But it's not something that we have to only, it's not something we can just give in childhood and then stop doing. It's important for us to be setting high expectations for all of our community members, providing opportunities for that oxytocin for all community members, building in positive relationships with caring people at every point of life. So this is something that I want to encourage you to think about. How do we put this in all different parts of our lives? And we can do that through providing opportunities for participation. So this is something that's really important. How are we involving people who've experienced trauma or adversity in relevant, engaging, and interesting activities? How are we providing opportunities for them to take on responsibilities, allowing contribution at home, at school, or in the community? So, all right, I don't know how to get rid of this. Nope. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing again because that worked. Let me see if that works. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about how do we regulate our own stress? How do we regulate our own stress? How do we regulate emotions as a strategy of building resilience for ourselves? So when we have unpredictable or prolonged senses of vulnerability, what we see is stress starts to take over for us. And what we want to do is kind of shift ourselves, add in predictability, add in controllability, and that way we build resilience for ourselves. So this is a perfect example of the last year and a half through COVID. What we saw across the board at our whole community, at our nation level, was a lot of unpredictability, a lot of prolonged levels of stress. And what in doing so, we need to shift to a space of focusing on ways we can build in predictability. So this goes for this type of stress we experienced in this last year, but it also goes for children who are experiencing stress on a regular basis, looking at how do we build in opportunities for predictability and buffer from that stress. And so some examples of what that might look like of ways we build in predictability is setting kind of daily schedules, some daily structure for ourselves and for the children in our lives. So if you're a teacher in a school, one way that you do that is by ensuring that kind of you set some basic guidelines for the students who come in the door and say, every day at this time, this is what we're going to do. It doesn't mean being so structured that you can't, go away from that, but making sure that there's a sense of safety, They know they can count on you to ensure that you're offering some predictability for them. As a parent or as a someone who's taking care of children inside your home, like offering opportunities for family meals together. And I'm not suggesting you do that every single day. I know how challenging that is, but maybe every Sunday we have a family meal together, or maybe that's every Friday night we have a family meal together, or looking at opportunities where we sit down together as a family and have that predictability in place. Offering opportunities for movement. Exercise is ideal. We want to have that kind of quick heartbeat moving types of exercise, but really just looking at, how do I build in movement? Am I stretching? Am I getting outside, getting fresh air? And those are all ways that we can really build resilience for ourselves. So those structure and predictability in your daily routine, it can look like waking up and going to bed at the same time. I talked about setting routines for weekdays of kind of ideas of, this is the expectation that we do this at this time generally. It doesn't mean every single minute of your day is built out, but really just looking at offering opportunities to build in that structure. Being intentional regarding the news and social media consumption, and really looking at ways that I can add in positive social interactions. So if I notice that I'm doing something that makes me feel kind of crummy or negative, how can I get rid of that? Stop doing that. And oftentimes we see that through the news and social media consumption, and we're seeing children younger and younger consuming that. So focusing on saying, let's set some limits of how much time we spend in that space. So the other way we calm our stress response is to really look at our, what does that look like when we feel stress? Taking a moment to take in that feeling and say, what do I feel? Do I feel it in my shoulders when I start to get a sense of stress? Do I notice I'm clenching or holding my jaw tight? What are you doing when you feel stress? Stress is what it does is it causes dysregulation, which is a psychological state. And so this is not just something that like, oh, I feel stressed and whatever. It's actually a psychological state to be in that place. And there's some really fantastic ways to calm that. So one way that we calm that is through our vagus nerve. And activating our vagus nerve, this is a nerve that's part of our brainstem. And what it does is it helps us calm down our whole nervous system. When we activate our vagus nerve, we rapidly turn off our stress response. It actually helps us sharpen our memories. It resists high blood pressure. It fights inflammatory disease, strengthens our immune system. We sleep better when we've activated our vagus nerve. And it helps us overcome depression and anxiety. And one of the best ways to activate our vagus nerve is through deep belly breathing. And so what I mean by that is really when you take a deep breath in, your belly should rise out from your body. You should, if you put your hand on it, you can feel that. For children, a way for us to practice this activity is to have them lay on their backs and put a stuffed animal or some sort of a friend of theirs on their belly, and have them watch their stuffed animal, their friend, rise up when they take a deep breath in and then fall back down when they exhale, when they let that breath out. So belly breathing is one of the best ways that we can activate the vagus nerve. We can also activate it though with other things that are a little less commonly known, and that includes cold water face immersion. So actually splashing our face with cold water, or even having an opportunity where you kind of have a basin and I used to do this a lot in the summertime when it would be really hot. Tip your head into cold water. That type of cold water against our face actually immediately helps us kind of let go of all those feelings. We can also do this through loud singing and loud gargling with water. So whatever suits your fancy, any way we can activate the vagus nerve is a great way for us to rapidly decrease our stress response. And the reason why activating our own stress or deactivating our own stress response and calming and regulating our own emotions is that we are not able to regulate someone else's emotions until we've first regulated our own. And co-regulating, so that process of helping someone else regulate their emotions, is something that's really critical to us as human beings, as social mammals. We need to co-regulate throughout our whole life. This is what we are meant and designed for, connection with other people. And so this is something that's really important for that. The reason why those caring adults and the connections with other people are so important is because that's where we're designed to be. We're meant to be co-regulating with other people. But we have to practice that. It's important for us to practice that skill in ourselves and then offer opportunities to practice that with our children and with the other children in our lives. So a tool for this that's fantastic. If you've never seen this book, it's a great book. It's called Alpha Breaths. And actually has fantastic, really simple breathing activities for both children and for adults. I have it for my child. It's a fun one to do. For an example, one of them is A is for alligator breath, and you kind of raise your arms really wide like an alligator mouth, and then as you exhale, you snap your hands back down together. So that's an example of it. It's a great book. I highly recommend it if you have small children in your lives. If you are a teacher in a classroom, this is a great tool for you. A really great, useful way of learning how to start to breathe. The other thing is that these kinds of tools are really helpful to practice in times when we're both feeling really calm and regulated ourselves. So it's not easy to remind children to calm down and to breathe, take deep breaths when we're already in an escalated state. We need to practice these skills when we feel good, so that when we feel stressed, we have a better way of activating into that type of a response. So that's a really big key here. So this is another thing. When you think back to when I was talking about our amygdala and what happens when our brains are under stress, if you remember, what I said is that when we're in that stress response, our brains are solely focused on safety and response to that. And therefore, they are not focused on learning new information or kind of processing, which is why I just said we want to practice those skills when we're feeling good, because when we're in a bad state, we're not going to be able to learn that new skill of practicing breathing. So the other thing is, it's going to be really important for us to think about the fact that we can't help a child kind of process what happened or dole out punishment because they behaved in a way we didn't like it. We have to first connect with that child, help them decrease their stress response, then we can correct the action. So this is about our left and our right side of our brain. So when we have, big right brain emotions, we're not thinking critically, which is our left side of our brain. We can't learn left brain lessons or redirection. So what we need to do is first be present. So take a moment, take a deep breath to calm ourselves down and regulate ourselves, because oftentimes when we're working with children, sometimes those big right brain emotions can trigger our own big right brain emotions, right? So it's important for us to first regulate ourselves. Then we're establishing that safe space and environment for a child. We need to listen closely. We need to not be the one talking and listen to what's causing that emotional reaction. Connect with them, offer acceptance and validation for the feelings that they're having, recognizing that feelings are natural. It's important for us to feel feelings. And then once we've calmed down, both of us have regulated, we feel good, then we can move into problem solving. We can move into kind of what's the reason. We can talk about that. But it's really important that we don't try to do that when that emotion is happening. So for older kids, so that's kind of one way when we're talking about younger kids, but older kids have that same thing. If any one of you has a teenager or you work with teenagers, this is a really great tool to think about this. It's actually a tool that was designed in Washington State in an alternative high school that implemented a number of trauma-informed practices across their school. And so they included this kind of bullseye idea of basically saying that when there was an emotional problem, both the adult and the child in the situation identified what kind of zone they were in before any sort of discipline was rolled out. And by doing this, the school increased their graduation rates by 30% and decreased their suspension rates by 85%. So basically, by simply recognizing that emotions are real, and they're the right side of our brain, and the reasoning and logic and discipline are the left side of our brain, they were able to first allow people to really calm down. And so again, what they did is kind of said, if you're in the red zone, I need a day or I need a few hours before I'm able to calm down. I'm feeling really charged right now. Yellow was, I'm not totally calm, but I just maybe need an hour to cool down. And green was, I'm ready to talk about what happened. And by allowing people to pick which zone they're in, it helped actually, the very process of picking which zone starts to kind of kick into that left side of your brain. So it actually helps you start to calm down by simply allowing opportunities to identify how someone's feeling. But it also allowed opportunities for people not to just kind of both flare way out of control, say things they don't mean to say, dole out punishment that they don't really intend to keep, and instead allow us to first have our emotion and then have the consequences or kind of responses to that emotion. So this gets to what we like to call name it to tame it. When you ask people, there's actually been studies on this where they asked people to name emotions. On average, most people can only name about 3 emotions. And that's because we don't talk about our emotions very often. It's kind of been something we simply say, we don't talk about how we're really feeling. People say, oh, I'm feeling fine. But what does that mean? What does fine mean? And so this is something that I think is a really important strategy to think about, even for ourselves. So start taking note of ourselves when we start to feel kind of emotionally charged. Stop and think about, what is the feeling that I'm having? Am I feeling anxious? Am I feeling overwhelmed? Am I feeling angry? Am I feeling worried? Am I feeling vulnerable? Stop and think about your emotions. And again, the very act of thinking about the emotion switches from our right side of our brain to our left side of our brain. So that very act of thinking and naming our emotions literally tame that emotion. So that is such a useful tool to kind of do. And if this is something you can implement within your family, within your classroom, within your own life, you can start by saying, hey, let's name it to tame it. So when we start to have big emotions, say, let's name it, folks. It's a great tool and strategy for you to use. So when adults practice these emotional regulation strategies, we actually in turn, and even if we're not doing it with children, even if we're just doing it for ourselves, we help show children how to do the same. And it helps build a resilient skill that is going to be helpful throughout their whole life. So this is just kind of a little example of when we say, when parents or adults, so I should just kind of actually nix that out there and say, when adults in the life of a child, when they show patience, they help a child also develop a sense of patience. They make a child wait, in which sense they start to learn that this is something that I have to do. When we stay calm, children learn how to calm themselves. They learn how to handle stressful situations. So, on a personal note, I can share this last year was really challenging as a parent. Many of us were working from home, or we were, or we had other stressors going on inside our lives, and we were trying to parent. And it was really hard. I wasn't, you had this sense of you're not in control of your own emotions. You're feeling an overwhelming sense of stress. And in turn, what you notice is that your patience was less for your child. Their emotions were out of control because your emotions were. So that point of co-regulation has the opposite effect of when we're not regulated. We see the children in our lives are not regulated as well. So if we practice those skills of regulating our own emotions, being kind to ourselves, practicing compassion, taking a positive outlook, what we see in turn is the children in our lives learn those same skills. So us practicing and role modeling for this builds this in children as well, just naturally. So we really think about this as kind of a paradigm shift. One way we've kind of ingrained ourselves in our communities to think about emotion and behaviors as being negative things. So when we see behavioral problems in the schools or in our community, we blame someone for it. We say, oh, it's the parent, or oh, that's the child, just is a bad kid. We put labels on it. And the reality is that emotions and behaviors are reaction. This is a developmental process. It's a reaction to the experiences we've had. And we want to build safety zones around that child. So we're not doling out rewards or punishments or consequences for emotions that they have. Instead, we're allowing opportunities for them to practice skills on how to handle the emotions that they feel, how to control the behaviors that they're having. And really, all of this is around shifting our idea that there's something wrong with people, that why are they acting that way? Instead, saying something's happened. Something's happened in that child's life, something happened in that adult's life, and what can we be doing to help them? This is huge. This shift in our mind of when we start to see in people who are using drugs, maybe, people who are having emotional response in a public space, people who are acting out, people who have a really hard time building relationships or building a sense of trust with people, rather than us going, what's wrong with that person? It's really about us shifting to saying, what's happened and what can we be doing to help? And so that's where we start to get into this idea that ACE scores are one score, but there's also other scores we can look at for people. And positive experience scores is another model that's kind of built out of this, of saying we can look at people's resilience, we can look at people's positive experience, and that's a way to measure someone's success and someone's future health and well-being. Positive experiences are really critical. And I love this quote. It's one of my favorites, but it's just helping us recognize that having a strong social network with many high quality relational interactions over time predicts good mental health and positive outcomes better than those traumatic experiences predict poor health outcomes and poor prospects. So let that sink in for a minute. I started this presentation by talking about how our brains handle stress and trauma and adversity, and how we have science and research that tells us that those things predict poor health outcomes for people. And there's science that shows ultimately they could lead to an earlier death for people. But the reality is those positive experiences that we have throughout our lives, that high quality relational interactions over time, do a better job of predicting our own mental health and those around us. And so that's what we really want to focus on. How do we build in positive relationships for people, positive experiences in every aspect of our community? And so that really starts with us. You know, what I said about our own emotion regulation is a way we build into other people. And so one way that you can build that in is being really practicing mindfulness. And mindfulness is something, you know, I think sometimes when people hear that, they think of kind of something that might be like, oh, I can't do that. I can't practice that. It's not something I'm used to. But mindfulness can simply be taking a pause and a moment of saying, where am I? That activity I asked you to do when we first started this presentation, which was to take 30 seconds of kind of centering yourself, that was mindfulness. That was a practice that you can build into every part of your life. One way to do this is when you're taking a shower, say, am I taking a shower? Oftentimes we get in the shower, we start doing something, and before you know it, you're like, did I wash my hair? I'm not sure if I did that. So that's a place of saying, let me just take a moment and pause and ask myself, what am I doing? When you're cooking dinner, pause. What am I doing? Where is my head at? That is mindfulness. And so when we practice mindfulness, it in turn creates really strong sense of self-care for ourselves. It's important for us to practice that. We're more likely to seek positive emotional experiences. We can choose to notice the good. And so there's a lot of really benefits for us practicing mindfulness within our own lives. Other kind of universal precautions we can take for ourselves, again, for us to build our own sense of resilience and build resilience in the other people around us. We talked about deep breathing, and you can practice yoga or dance or just getting some movement in your life of looking at how can I move more in this space. Practicing that is a great way for us to take care of ourselves. It helps benefit our own well-being and those around us. Some people, it's going to be through more expressions such as art or music or journaling. Some you can use, pressure holds. There's different strategies for all of this. Now, self-care can also be in the forms of getting peer support, finding someone in your life who's a support person in your life who's going to help you kind of navigate through challenging times. or getting mentoring or counseling depending on the stressors that you're experiencing at this time. The other thing is to make sure that we're taking breaks in your day. So especially when things have been really stressful, recognizing that our brain responds to short doses of input. So really taking note of that, and saying, okay, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to get up and I'm going to walk for 90 seconds. And then I'm going to take another 90 seconds just to breathe. And that minute and a half can do amazing to refocus you, get you back ready to kind of take on the next task. This is a way we build resilience. Again, that ability to handle stressful situations is really critical for us and for the people around us. You know, like I said, connecting with a point person, having leaders who intentionally regulate themselves and check in with their team members, if you're someone who plays a leadership role, is a really important opportunity for us to build in resilience in the workplace, or if you play that role in your community, to do it that way. The important thing for us to realize when it comes to all of what I've talked about today is that people are what makes the difference. It's people, not programs, not money, that change other people. And so I hope that by you taking the time to learn about what I've talked about today, you recognize that you are a person in someone's life and you are going to be a difference. And so what can you be doing to protect your own well-being and to help foster well-being in them? I want to just offer some resources to you. I've told you sometimes, like I said, this information is really challenging. I hope that I've provided you with a lot of kind of tools and resources that make you realize how tangible these challenges can be in our lives, how we can really move forward. But I also recognize that it's challenging to think about this stuff. And so I want you to know that there are a lot of resources for you. There is a statewide crisis line. There's a peer support warm line that also helps with youth. And 211 also offers a number of resources in your community. If you are a teen or you work with teenagers, this is a really fantastic resource for teens. It's designed specifically for youth ages 14 to 20, and it's a texting line. It's staffed by young people. It's a great resource for you to have. I also want to make sure you have my contact information. I am really happy to answer any questions you might have after this presentation, any lingering thoughts you may have. Feel free to reach out to me if you're watching this recording and you have questions or thoughts around it. It's really important for you to know that I'm here and I'm happy to listen and respond in any way that I can. So I'm going to invite Kendall to stop the recording. And for this is just an opportunity for you to take a moment to have a reflective